The letter trembled in Rachel's hands as she stood in the empty bedroom, her husband's handwriting blurring through tears she refused to shed. 3 weeks. Just 3 weeks since Michael had collapsed without warning. And now this. A cryptic final message directing her to a place he'd never mentioned in 16 years of marriage. Outside the window, storm clouds gathered over the city she'd called home her entire life. Her 4 children waited downstairs, their grief still raw, their futures uncertain. The address scrawled at the bottom of the letter felt like a lifeline thrown from beyond the grave. Silver Creek, Montana. But as Rachel folded the paper and slipped it into her pocket, she couldn't shake the feeling that Michael hadn't just left her instructions, he'd left her a warning. The highway stretched endlessly before them, swallowing mile after mile of asphalt beneath the worn tires of their aging SUV. Rachel's knuckles had turned white against the steering wheel hours ago, but she couldn't seem to loosen her grip. In the rearview mirror, she watched Emily stare out the window with hollow eyes, earbuds blocking out the world that had shattered around them. Will and Evan sat between their sister and little Jake, the twins unusually silent as they passed through landscapes that grew increasingly unfamiliar. Mountains rose in the distance like ancient sentinels, their peaks still crowned with snow despite the approaching summer. Before we continue with Rachel's journey, I want to ask you something important. If you're enjoying this story and want to see how Rachel's life unfolds in Silver Creek, please subscribe to our channel. We're working hard to reach 1,000 subscribers so we can keep bringing you emotional, gripping stories like this one. Your support means everything to us. 3 weeks had passed since the morning Michael collapsed in their kitchen, coffee cup still in his hand. The aneurysm had been swift, the doctors said. He felt no pain. But Rachel felt everything. She felt the weight of 4 pairs of eyes looking to her for answers she didn't have. She felt the suffocating silence of their home, without his laughter filling the spaces between walls. She felt the crushing responsibility of single-handedly navigating a future she'd never imagined facing alone. And now she felt the absurdity of driving toward a town she'd never heard of, because a letter hidden in Michael's desk drawer told her to trust him one last time. The letter had appeared when she'd been sorting through insurance documents, her hands moving mechanically through the mundane aftermath of death. It had been tucked behind an old tax return, the envelope yellowed with age, but Michael's handwriting unmistakably fresh, written recently, deliberately placed where she would eventually find it. The words had been simple, almost frustratingly so. Rachel, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm sorry for everything I never told you. Take Emily, Will, Evan, and Jake to Silver Creek, Montana. The address is below. There's a house. It belonged to my family. It's yours now. Confie en main. Trust me. I know I'm asking a lot, but this is important. More important than I ever had the courage to explain. Please go. Love always, Michael. Silver Creek appeared through the windshield, like something pulled from a forgotten era. The main street couldn't have been more than a few blocks long, lined with buildings that wore their age proudly, wooden storefronts with hand-painted signs, a small general store with a faded awning, a diner with red vinyl booths visible through streaked windows. A handful of pickup trucks sat parked at angles along the street, their beds carrying tools and supplies that spoke of working lives. Rachel slowed the SUV to a crawl, acutely aware of the faces that turned to watch them pass. An elderly man in coveralls paused mid-step outside the hardware store. A woman sweeping the sidewalk in front of what looked like a cafe stopped, broom suspended in air. Their expressions weren't hostile exactly, but they weren't welcoming either. Just watchful, measuring, waiting. "Mom, where are we going?" Jake's small voice broke the silence, cutting through the tension that had filled the vehicle for the last 100 miles. Rachel glanced at the GPS on her phone, though she'd memorized the directions hours ago. The address Michael had left led them away from the main street, down a narrow road that wound between towering pines and scattered properties where horses grazed behind weathered fences. When they finally reached the turnoff, Rachel's breath caught in her throat. The house stood at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by overgrown grass and wildflowers that had claimed the yard as their own. It was larger than she'd expected, a 2-story structure with faded blue paint and a wraparound porch that sagged slightly on one side. Windows stared out like vacant eyes, some covered with boards, others merely dark and empty. Rachel killed the engine, and for a long moment nobody moved. The silence pressed against them, broken only by the whisper of wind through pine branches and the distant call of a bird she couldn't identify. Emily pulled out her earbuds, her face registering the same disbelief Rachel felt churning in her stomach. "This is it?" her daughter asked, voice flat. "This is where Dad wanted us to go?" Rachel had no answer that would make sense, no explanation that wouldn't sound like madness. She pushed open the driver's door and stepped onto gravel that crunched beneath her shoes. The air smelled different here, cleaner somehow, tinged with pine and earth and something wild that made her city lungs expand involuntarily. The children followed her out slowly, clustering close as they approached the porch steps. Rachel tested the first step with her weight, relieved when it held firm despite its appearance. The front door hung slightly crooked in its frame, but when she turned the key Michael had left in the envelope, the lock clicked open with surprising ease. The door swung inward with a groan that echoed through empty rooms beyond. Dust motes swirled in shafts of light that sliced through gaps in the boarded windows. The interior smelled of abandonment, musty air and old wood and years of stillness. But underneath those scents, Rachel detected something else, something that made her throat tighten unexpectedly. It smelled like memory, like the ghost of lives once lived within these walls. They moved through the house as a unit, nobody willing to separate in the shadowy dimness. The furniture remained, covered in sheets that had once been white but had grayed with time. A living room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with vintage appliances that looked functional despite their age. Upstairs, 4 bedrooms waited, beds stripped but frames intact. In what must have been the master bedroom, Rachel found the first photograph. It sat on a dusty nightstand, the frame tarnished but the image still clear behind smudged glass. A young couple smiled at the camera, the woman holding a small boy who couldn't have been more than 2 or 3 years old. Rachel picked it up with trembling hands, wiping the glass with her sleeve. The little boy had Michael's eyes, unmistakably, heartbreakingly his eyes. "Mom?" Emily stood in the doorway, her voice uncertain, in a way that made her sound younger than 14. "Did Dad live here?" The question hung in the air, laden with all the confusion and betrayal Rachel felt clawing at her chest. Michael had never mentioned Montana. He'd never spoken of a childhood home or family property or a town called Silver Creek. Their entire marriage had been built in the city where they'd met in college, where they'd raised their children in a modest suburban house with neighbors they'd known for years. Yet here she stood in a house filled with evidence of a past Michael had deliberately hidden, left with nothing but a cryptic letter and a town full of strangers who watched them like intruders. As the sun began to sink toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Rachel stood on that sagging porch and looked out at the wild landscape surrounding them. Pine forests stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by glimpses of distant peaks and the silver thread of what might have been a creek cutting through the valley below. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache, raw and untamed, and nothing like the manicured parks and busy streets she'd known her entire life. Somewhere in the gathering dusk, an owl called out, its voice haunting and strange. Rachel wrapped her arms around herself and wondered what other secrets this place held, what truths Michael had been too afraid to share while he lived. The sound of tires on gravel made her turn sharply. A pickup truck was rolling up their driveway, its headlights cutting through the twilight. Rachel's heart hammered as she stepped to the edge of the porch, positioning herself between the approaching vehicle and the house where her children waited inside. The truck stopped, and an elderly man climbed out slowly, his movements careful with age. He wore work clothes and a baseball cap pulled low over weathered features. When he looked up at her, his expression was unreadable in the fading light. "You're Rachel Porter," he said, and it wasn't a question. His voice carried the weight of certainty, of knowledge she didn't possess. "Michael's wife." Rachel could only nod, her voice trapped somewhere in her throat. The man studied her for a long moment before his features softened into something that might have been sympathy, or perhaps regret. "Name's Anderson. I lived down the road from the Porter family, back when this house wasn't empty." He paused, removing his cap and turning it in weathered hands. I wondered if anyone would ever come back to Silver Creek. I wondered if Michael ever told his family the truth about this place. The darkness gathered around them as Rachel stared at this stranger, who somehow knew her husband's name, who spoke of truths she'd never been told. And in that moment, standing in the shadow of a house filled with ghosts and secrets, Rachel understood that Michael hadn't just sent them to Montana for a fresh start. He'd sent them into the heart of a mystery that would either save them or consume them entirely. The days in Silver Creek moved with a strange rhythm, slower than the frenetic pulse of city life, yet heavier somehow, weighted with questions that had no easy answers. Rachel threw herself into making the old house habitable, scrubbing decades of dust from windowsills, airing out rooms that had been sealed for too long, coaxing life back into a home that had forgotten what it meant to shelter a family. Emily helped without complaint, though her silence spoke volumes. The twins explored the property with cautious wonder, discovering a rusted swing set behind the house and a creek that bubbled over smooth stones at the edge of the tree line. Jake shadowed Rachel everywhere, his small hand finding hers whenever uncertainty crept too close. Mr. Anderson returned on the third day, his truck rattling up the driveway in late afternoon when golden light slanted through the pines. This time he brought supplies, cleaning products, light bulbs, a box of groceries that included fresh bread from someone named Margaret, who ran the cafe in town. He also brought something more valuable: answers. They sat on the porch while the children played in the yard, and Mr. Anderson's weathered voice painted pictures of a past Rachel had never known existed. Michael had been born in this house, he explained, the only child of Thomas and Catherine Porter. The family had been well respected in Silver Creek, landowners who'd held their property for 3 generations. They were good people, Mr. Anderson said, his gaze distant with memory. Tom Porter was fair in his dealings, always willing to help a neighbor. Catherine taught music lessons to half the kids in town, including mine. He paused, fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. But things changed when Michael was about 7 years old. There was a disagreement, a bad one, with some folks who wanted to buy the Porter land. They offered money, lots of it, but Tom wouldn't sell. Said the land was his children's inheritance, said the water that ran through their property belonged to the whole valley, not some corporation looking to profit. The old man's jaw tightened at the memory. Things got ugly fast. Threats were made, though nobody could ever prove who was behind them. Then one night, the Porter's barn burned down. Rachel's breath caught in her chest. Michael never mentioned any of this, never said a word about Montana or this house or... Her voice broke, frustration and grief tangling together until she couldn't separate them. Mr. Anderson nodded slowly, understanding written in the lines of his weathered face. Tom and Catherine left town 2 weeks after the fire, packed up in the middle of the night and disappeared. Most folks figured they'd been scared off for good. The house sat empty, and eventually people stopped talking about the Porters altogether. He looked at Rachel then, his eyes sharp despite his age. Until you showed up. News travels fast in a small town, Mrs. Porter. People know you're here, and they're wondering why Michael's widow would come back to a place he spent his whole life running from. That night, after the children had fallen asleep in their newly claimed bedrooms, Rachel couldn't rest. She moved through the house with a flashlight, examining corners she'd been too busy to explore during daylight hours. The master bedroom held more photographs now that she'd unpacked the boxes from the nightstand, images of a young family frozen in moments of ordinary happiness. Michael as a toddler, gap-toothed and grinning. Michael learning to ride a bicycle with training wheels, his father's hands steadying him. Michael and his mother at a piano, her hands guiding his across the keys. Each image felt like a theft, a piece of her husband's life that he'd deliberately kept from her, hidden behind walls of silence she'd never known existed. She pulled open drawers methodically, finding yellowed linens and mothballs, old receipts and forgotten letters that spoke of grocery orders and town council meetings. Nothing that explained why Michael had erased this entire chapter of his history. Frustration mounted with each empty drawer until Rachel found herself standing in the closet, yanking at boards that lined the back wall, not entirely sure what she was looking for, but unable to stop searching. One board came loose in her hands with surprising ease, revealing darkness behind it. Her heart hammered as she pulled away another board, then another, until a gap opened large enough to shine her flashlight through. The compartment was small, barely 2 feet deep, carved into the space between the closet and the exterior wall, but it wasn't empty. Rachel's hands trembled as she reached inside, fingers closing around objects that had been hidden for decades. She pulled out a wooden box first, its surface smooth with age and careful handling. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that crumbled at her touch, were more photographs, dozens of them, documenting Michael's early childhood in vivid detail. Birthday parties in this very house, Christmas mornings with presents piled beneath a tree, summer days swimming in what looked like the creek behind the property. Beneath the photographs lay notebooks, the kind children use in school, with lined pages and construction paper covers decorated in crayon. Rachel opened one with reverent care, and Michael's childhood handwriting leaped off the page. They were journals of sorts, filled with drawings and observations that painted Silver Creek through a 7-year-old's eyes. Today I saw a bear cub by the creek. Mum says we have to be careful and make noise so the mama bear knows we're there. I drew a picture of it. The drawing was crude but earnest, all round shapes and stick legs. Rachel turned pages, watching her husband's childhood unfold in sketches and misspelled words. Each entry a window into the boy he'd been before whatever happened here had forced his family to flee. But the most significant discovery lay at the bottom of the compartment, a manila envelope thick with documents that crackled when she lifted them into the light. Land deeds, property surveys, water rights documentation dating back to the 1800s, when Michael's great-great-grandfather had first purchased the property from the territorial government. Rachel spread them across the bedroom floor, trying to make sense of legal language and survey maps that showed the Porter property extending far beyond what she'd assumed were their boundaries. The land wasn't just the house and immediate yard. It stretched for acres, encompassing forest and creek bed, and what appeared to be natural springs marked on the survey as primary water source for Silver Creek Valley. A separate document, handwritten and dated just weeks before Michael died, made her blood run cold. It was a letter from Michael's father, Thomas, addressed to whoever comes after me. The paper had been handled repeatedly, creases worn soft with reading and rereading. "If you're holding this," Thomas Porter had written in shaky script, "it means the fight isn't over. The land they wanted from us, it's not about the acreage or the timber or anything we could sell them. It's about the water. The springs on our property feed every creek, stream and well in this valley. Control that water, and you control Silver Creek. They tried to take it from us through purchase, then through intimidation, then through violence. We left to protect our son, to give Michael a chance at a life without looking over his shoulder. But the land is still ours, legally and rightfully, and someday, maybe the threat will pass." Rachel sat back on her heels, the letter trembling in her hands as understanding crashed over her like a wave. Michael hadn't abandoned Silver Creek. He'd been driven away as a child, scarred by whatever he'd witnessed here. But he'd kept these documents, preserved this evidence, and in his final act had sent his family back to the place he'd been too afraid to face himself. The weight of it pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. Outside the window, Silver Creek lay peaceful beneath star-scattered darkness, its mountains standing sentinel over secrets that ran deeper than she'd imagined. And somewhere out there, Mr. Anderson had said, people were watching, wondering why the Porter family had finally come home. Rachel carefully gathered the documents, photographs and notebooks, placing them back in the wooden box with hands that wouldn't quite steady. She understood now that Michael's final request hadn't been about giving them a fresh start or a place to heal from grief. It had been about finishing something that his parents had left undone, about reclaiming something that had been stolen through fear and violence. But as she climbed into bed in a house full of ghosts and unanswered questions, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that understanding the past was only the beginning, and that the real battle for Silver Creek was about to begin. Morning arrived with a clarity that made the mountains look close enough to touch, their peaks etched against a sky so blue it seemed unreal. Rachel stood at the kitchen window, watching steam rise from her coffee cup while the children ate breakfast at the old wooden table she'd scrubbed back to life. 2 weeks had passed since Mr. Anderson's revelations, 2 weeks of slowly piecing together the puzzle of Michael's hidden past. while trying to create something resembling normalcy for 4 grieving children. Emily had started talking again, her silence gradually giving way to questions about the father she'd thought she knew. The twins had discovered a family of deer that grazed at the forest edge each dawn, so even Jake's nightmares had become less frequent, replaced by exhausted sleep, earned through days spent exploring their unexpected inheritance. The sound of an engine cut through the morning stillness, different from Mr. Anderson's familiar truck rattle, smoother and more refined. Rachel's spine straightened instinctively as a sleek black sedan rolled up the gravel driveway, its polished surface gleaming incongruously against the backdrop of weathered wood and wild grass. The vehicle stopped with precision, and a man emerged wearing clothes that cost more than Rachel's monthly grocery budget. Tailored slacks, crisp white shirt, leather shoes that had no business on a Montana ranch. He moved with the calculated confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted, his eyes scanning the property with an appraising gaze that made Rachel's skin crawl. She met him on the porch, positioning herself at the top of the steps in a deliberate claim of higher ground. Up close, she could see he was perhaps 50, with silver threading through dark hair and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Mrs. Porter," he said, extending a hand she didn't take. "Robert Harlan. I represent Mr. Charles Whitmore, a prominent businessman in this region." His voice carried the smooth polish of someone who'd perfected the art of persuasion, each word measured and deliberate. "I hope you're settling in well. Silver Creek can be quite an adjustment for folks accustomed to city conveniences. What can I do for you, Mr. Harlan?" Rachel kept her voice neutral, her arms crossed against her chest in a posture that invited nothing. Behind her, she heard movement inside the house. Emily shepherding her brothers away from the windows, protecting them from whatever this encounter might become. Harlan's smile widened slightly, acknowledging her directness with an almost imperceptible nod. "I'll get straight to the point then. Mr. Whitmore has been acquiring property in this valley for the past several years. He's developing a resort, high-end, environmentally conscious, the kind of project that would bring jobs and prosperity to Silver Creek. Your land sits at the heart of his development plan." Rachel said nothing, simply watched him with steady eyes while her heart hammered against her ribs. Harlan continued, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket with practiced ease. "Mr. Whitmore is prepared to be very generous. The house alone is worth perhaps $50,000 in its current condition, and the acreage, well—" He opened the envelope, revealing a check already made out in her name. The number of zeros made Rachel's breath catch despite herself. $500,000, Mrs. Porter. Enough to set you and your children up comfortably anywhere you choose. Enough to start fresh without the burden of maintaining this old place. The check hung in the air between them, a temptation wrapped in practicality. Rachel thought about Emily's college fund that had been depleted by funeral costs, about medical bills that still arrived with depressing regularity, about the twins' shoes that were already getting tight, and Jake's therapy appointments that insurance barely covered. $500,000 could solve so many problems, could ease so many of the grinding anxieties that kept her awake at night. But it could also erase the last tangible connection to Michael's hidden past, could surrender the answers she'd only just begun to uncover. No. The word came out stronger than she felt, rooted in something deeper than financial desperation. Harlan's smile didn't falter, but something shifted behind his eyes, a flash of steel beneath the polished exterior. "Mrs. Porter, I don't think you understand the generosity of this offer. Properties like this in rural Montana typically sell for a fraction—" I said no. Rachel's hands tightened against her arms, nails digging into her own skin to keep herself grounded. "This house belonged to my husband's family. It's not for sale." The silence stretched between them, loaded with implications Rachel didn't fully understand, but could feel pressing against her like a physical weight. Harlan carefully returned the check to his pocket, his movements deliberate and slow. When he looked at her again, the pretense of friendliness had evaporated, replaced by something colder and infinitely more dangerous. "Mr. Whitmore has invested considerable resources into this project, Mrs. Porter. Years of planning, millions of dollars in preliminary development. He's not accustomed to obstacles." The words carried an edge that made them feel less like information and more like warning. Silver Creek needs this resort. The economy here has been dying for decades. People need jobs, need hope, need a future. One family's sentimental attachment shouldn't stand in the way of progress. Then Mr. Whitmore should have planned around property he didn't own, Rachel said, though her voice trembled slightly now, betraying the fear she was trying to hide. Harlan descended one step, closing the distance between them just enough to feel threatening without being overtly aggressive. I'd encourage you to reconsider. Mr. Whitmore doesn't like hearing the word no. It tends to make things complicated. He let the sentence hang in the air, unfinished but unmistakable in its implication. Then, as smoothly as he'd arrived, he turned and walked back to his sedan, gravel crunching beneath expensive shoes. Before this story continues, I need to ask for your help. If you're invested in Rachel's fight to protect her family and uncover the truth, please hit that subscribe button. We're so close to 1,000 subscribers, and your support allows us to keep creating these powerful stories. Don't let Rachel face this battle alone. Join our community and see how her courage changes everything. Rachel watched the black sedan disappear down the driveway, her legs suddenly weak enough that she had to sit on the porch steps to keep from collapsing. Her hands shook as she pressed them against her face, trying to process what had just happened. The threat had been veiled but unmistakable, couched in professional language that couldn't disguise its true nature. Charles Whitmore wanted her land, and men like that, men with money and power, and years invested in their plans, didn't simply accept defeat and walk away. She found Mr. Anderson's number in her phone and called with fingers that wouldn't quite steady. He arrived within the hour, his weathered face grim as she recounted the encounter. "Charles Whitmore," he said, the name tasting bitter in his mouth. "Should have known he was behind this." He gestured for Rachel to follow him, leading her to his truck where he pulled out a folder stuffed with newspaper clippings and printed articles. "Whitmore's been buying up properties around here for 5 years, ever since he decided Silver Creek was ripe for development. Most folks sold willingly enough, times are hard and he pays well, but the ones who didn't." His finger tapped a headline about a suspicious fire that had destroyed a barn, another about a family who'd left town abruptly after their well mysteriously ran dry. "You're saying he's dangerous?" Rachel's voice came out barely above a whisper. Mr. Anderson's expression was answer enough. "I'm saying men like Whitmore don't let anything stand between them and profit, and the Porterland. It's the keystone of his whole plan. Without it, without access to those springs and water rights, his resort dies before it's built." He looked at her with something like pity in his weathered eyes. "You need to talk to Mark Rivers. He's been fighting Whitmore's development from the beginning, trying to organize the community, protect what's left of Silver Creek's independence. If anyone can help you understand what you're up against, it's him." That evening, Rachel stood in the master bedroom, holding the wooden box of documents she'd discovered in the hidden compartment. Thomas Porter's letter lay on top, his shaky handwriting a testament to fear and determination. "Control the water, control Silver Creek," he'd written. And now, decades later, another powerful man wanted exactly that. Wanted to turn natural springs that fed an entire valley into amenities for wealthy tourists, wanted to pave over history and community for profit margins and luxury accommodations. Michael had sent them here knowing this fight wasn't over, knowing his widow and children would become the final barrier between Whitmore's ambitions and the land his ancestors had protected for generations. Rachel traced her fingers over Michael's childhood drawings in the notebooks, simple sketches of the creek, the mountains, the wildlife he'd loved before fear had driven his family away. She thought about the boy he'd been, innocent and unburdened, and the man he'd become, carrying silence like armor against a past too painful to confront. He'd given her this task, not because she was strong enough to handle it, but because he'd believed she could become strong enough. Because he'd trusted that love for him and for their children would be sufficient motivation to stand against whatever darkness he'd fled from as a child. Through the window, twilight painted Silver Creek in shades of purple and gold, the mountains standing eternal watch over the valley spread below. Somewhere out there, Charles Whitmore was making plans, calculating his next move in a game where the stakes were measured in water rights and property deeds, and the future of a community he saw only as a business opportunity. And here she stood, a grieving widow with 4 children and a house full of secrets, holding documents that proved legal ownership of something infinitely more valuable than she'd understood. The box felt heavier than it should in her hands, weighted with responsibility and consequence. But as Rachel looked at her reflection in the darkening window, at the woman she'd become in the weeks since Michael's death, harder and more determined than the person she'd been, she understood that some battles chose you rather than the other way around. And whether she was ready or not, whether she felt capable or not, the war for Silver Creek had already begun, and surrender had never been an option Michael would have left her. Mark Rivers met Rachel at the town's only cafe, a cramped space with mismatched chairs and the smell of fresh coffee cutting through decades of absorbed conversations. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 40, with calloused hands and eyes that had seen too many losing battles. "Your husband's family owned the most important piece of land in this valley," he said without preamble, spreading a survey map across the scarred wooden table. His finger traced blue lines marking water sources. "These springs feed everything: wells, irrigation, the creek that runs through town. Whitmore's resort needs millions of gallons daily. Without your property, his whole project collapses." Rachel's hands trembled as she pulled out Thomas Porter's letter and the old land deeds. Mark's eyes widened as he examined them, his lawyer's mind cataloguing their significance. "These are solid. Original territorial grants, continuous family ownership, water rights that predate statehood." He looked at her with something like hope. This could stop him, but Rachel, Whitmore doesn't play fair. If he knows you have these documents, he'll find ways to challenge them, delay you in court, make your life unbearable until you give up. That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. She returned to Michael's childhood notebooks, reading by flashlight while the house settled around her. On the last page of the oldest journal, she found something she'd missed before, a crude map drawn in crayon, labeled in Michael's 7-year-old handwriting, "My secret place, Eagle Ridge." The drawing showed a path from the house, winding up through trees to what looked like a rock formation. Beside it, Michael had written, "This is where I hide my treasures." Morning came cold and grey, clouds pressing low against the mountains. Rachel left the children with Mr. Anderson's wife, claiming she needed supplies from town. Instead, she drove to where the map indicated the trail began, parking where gravel gave way to forest. The path was overgrown but still visible, a thread of packed earth winding upward through pines that towered like cathedral pillars. She climbed for over an hour, her city legs burning with effort, lungs working hard in the thin mountain air. Eagle Ridge revealed itself gradually, a formation of weathered granite, jutting from the mountainside like ancient bones breaking through skin. Rachel circled the rock slowly, searching for anything that might match a child's idea of a hiding place. Behind a boulder large enough to shelter a small car, she found it, a narrow opening between stones barely wide enough for an adult to squeeze through. Her heart hammered as she pulled out her phone's flashlight and crawled inside. The space opened into a natural shelter, walls smoothed by centuries of wind and water. Someone had made this place deliberately hidden. Branches had been arranged to disguise the entrance, and inside, a wooden crate sat protected from the elements. Rachel's hands shook as she pried open the lid. Inside lay treasures that made her chest tighten with emotion, more photographs of young Michael, his parents, his grandparents. Property surveys more detailed than the ones she'd found in the house, tax records and legal correspondence proving unbroken Porter family ownership dating back to 1889. But the most important discovery waited at the bottom, an envelope addressed simply to Rachel in Michael's adult handwriting. She opened it with trembling fingers, recognizing the same pen he'd used for the letter that brought her to Silver Creek. "If you're reading this, you found Eagle Ridge. I'm sorry for the secrets, for the silence, for leaving you to fight battles I was too afraid to face. My parents fled this place to protect me, and I grew up with their fear like a shadow I couldn't escape. But fear is a terrible inheritance to pass to our children." The letter continued, Michael's words painting the night the barn burned, the threats whispered in darkness, his mother's tears as they packed everything they could carry. "I never stopped feeling like a coward for not coming back. for not reclaiming what was stolen from my family through intimidation. The documents in this box prove our legal right to the land, everything you need to fight whoever inevitably comes looking to take it. I couldn't face that fight while I was alive, Rachel, but I trust you to be braver than I was. Protect our children. Protect Silver Creek. The land isn't just property. It's the lifeblood of the entire valley. Don't let them take it. Rachel sat in that stone shelter as afternoon light slanted through the entrance, holding her dead husband's confession while tears tracked silently down her face. She understood now, understood the weight he'd carried, the shame that had kept him silent, the final act of courage that had sent his family back to finish what his parents had started. Michael hadn't abandoned Silver Creek. He'd spent his entire life gathering evidence, preserving proof, preparing for a confrontation he'd hoped time might make unnecessary. She packed everything carefully into her backpack and began the descent as shadows lengthened across the mountain. But halfway down the trail, Rachel stopped abruptly. Through the trees below, she could see her car and the black sedan parked beside it. Robert Harlan leaned against his vehicle, arms crossed, waiting with the patient confidence of someone who knew she had nowhere else to go. Rachel's grip tightened on the backpack straps, feeling the weight of documents that could save or doom her. Harlan had followed her, or had her followed, which meant Whitmore knew she was searching for something, knew she'd likely found it. The game had shifted, and as she stood on that mountainside with evidence of her legal rights pressing against her back and Whitmore's representative blocking her path forward, Rachel understood that the real battle was about to begin, and there would be no more warnings, no more polite offers, only the raw conflict between those who wanted to control Silver Creek and those willing to die protecting it. Rachel descended the mountain trail with deliberate steps, her mind calculating options while her heart hammered against her ribs. Harlan straightened as she approached, his expression unreadable behind expensive sunglasses. "Productive hike, Mrs. Porter." His voice carried false casualness that fooled no one. "Beautiful country up there. Easy to get lost if you're not careful." "I'm not lost," Rachel said, her hand instinctively protecting the backpack. Harlan's smile was razor-thin. "Mister, Whitmore wanted me to extend one final courtesy. The offer stands, $500,000, no questions asked, but his patience has limits." He stepped closer, voice dropping. "Accidents happen in these mountains, Mrs. Porter. People get hurt, homes catch fire, children get scared. Think carefully about what you're risking." The threat hung between them, naked and undeniable. But something had shifted in Rachel during those hours on the mountain, reading Michael's confession, holding proof of her family's legacy. "Tell Mr. Whitmore I'll see him at the town meeting tonight," she said, voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Tell him to bring his lawyers. I'm bringing mine." Mark Rivers made the calls while Rachel drove straight to his office. Within hours, word spread through Silver Creek like wildfire. The Porter widow was making a stand, and the community was invited to witness it. The town hall filled beyond capacity by 7 o'clock, people standing along walls and spilling onto the steps outside. Rachel sat at the front table, the wooden box of documents before her, her children safe at Mr. Anderson's house, while she fought the battle Michael had left unfinished. Charles Whitmore arrived fashionably late, his entrance calculated for maximum impact. He was older than Rachel expected, mid-60s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to owning every room he entered. 2 lawyers flanked him, carrying briefcases that probably cost more than most Silver Creek residents earned in a month. He took a seat across from Rachel, his gaze dismissive, already moving past her to assess the crowd with the cold calculation of a predator measuring prey. Mark stood, his voice cutting through nervous whispers. "We're here tonight because Mr. Whitmore's resort development requires land that belongs to Rachel Porter, land her husband's family has owned for over a century. Mrs. Porter has documentation proving legal ownership and water rights that predate any claims Mr. Whitmore might make." He pulled documents from the box one by one, holding them up for the crowd to see. Original land grants, tax records showing continuous ownership, water rights registered with the territorial government in 1889. Whitmore's lawyer stood smoothly. "Mr. Whitmore has invested $7 million in preliminary development based on good faith negotiations with Silver Creek residents. One family's refusal to participate threatens jobs, economic growth, and the future prosperity of this entire community. His words were polished, persuasive, painting Rachel as the villain in a story about progress versus selfish obstruction. But Rachel had learned something in the weeks since Michael's death. Grief could burn away fear, leaving only determination in its wake. She stood, her voice quieter than the lawyer's, but carrying weight that commanded attention. My husband's family was driven from this town through threats and violence because they wouldn't sell land that controlled the valley's water supply. Now, Mr. Whitmore wants the same thing, to control the springs that feed every well, every creek, every living thing in Silver Creek. His resort would consume millions of gallons daily while you fight for scraps. She pulled out Thomas Porter's letter, reading aloud his words about intimidation and the barn fire. Then Michael's letter from Eagle Ridge, his confession of fear and hope that his children might reclaim what terror had stolen. The room fell silent, the weight of history pressing against present urgency. When Rachel finished, she looked directly at Whitmore. You can't buy what isn't for sale, and you can't threaten me into surrendering my children's inheritance. Whitmore stood slowly, his composure cracking just enough to reveal the steel beneath. This community is dying. I'm offering salvation, jobs, tourism revenue, a future beyond scraping by on failing ranches and empty storefronts. One woman's sentimental attachment to the past shouldn't condemn an entire town to poverty. His voice rose, commanding and authoritative. Who here wants employment? Who wants their children to have opportunities? Who wants Silver Creek to survive? For a moment, silence hung heavy with temptation. Then Mr. Anderson stood, his weathered frame somehow dignified in worn denim. I want Silver Creek to survive. But I want it to survive as Silver Creek, not as some millionaire's playground where locals serve drinks to tourists and watch our water get sold to the highest bidder. Others rose with him, voices joining in agreement. The tide was turning, shifting from Whitmore's carefully constructed narrative towards something rawer and more honest. Mark called for a vote, not legally binding, but morally significant. All in favor of supporting Rachel Porter's legal ownership and developing a community-based plan for sustainable land use, raise your hands. Hands rose throughout the room, a forest of defiance. Mark counted carefully. 73 in favor. He paused. Opposed? Only 5 hands appeared, all belonging to people with obvious financial ties to Whitmore's development. Whitmore's face flushed red with fury and humiliation. He swept from the hall without another word, his lawyers scrambling to follow. The room erupted in applause and relieved laughter, people crowding around Rachel with congratulations and promises of support. But Rachel felt no triumph, only exhausted relief, and the understanding that while this battle was won, the war might continue in courtrooms and through methods she couldn't yet anticipate. As the crowd dispersed into the cool Montana night, Rachel stood outside the town hall looking at Silver Creek's main street, bathed in lamplight. For the first time in decades, the community had stood together against power and money, had chosen preservation over profit. Michael had sent her here believing she could be brave enough for both of them. And tonight, surrounded by people who'd become allies in a fight she never asked for, Rachel finally understood what he'd known all along, that home wasn't just a place you inherited, but something you fought to protect, no matter the cost. Spring arrived in Silver Creek with an explosion of wildflowers that painted the valley in impossible colors: purple lupines, yellow balsam root, delicate white avalanche lilies pushing through the last patches of melting snow. 6 months had passed since that night in the town hall, when an entire community chose preservation over profit, when voices united against power that had seemed insurmountable. The seasons had turned, carrying away the sharp edges of grief and replacing them with something quieter, deeper. A healing that came not from forgetting, but from building something meaningful with the pieces left behind. Rachel stood at the edge of what they now called the Porter Community Reserve, watching as a family from Billings followed one of the marked ecological trails that wound through protected forest. The transformation had been remarkable. Mark Rivers had helped establish a non-profit structure that kept the land in perpetual trust while generating sustainable income through carefully managed ecotourism. Visitors came to hike pristine trails, photograph wildlife and experience Montana wilderness without destroying what made it special. The revenue flowed back into Silver Creek, supporting schools, maintaining infrastructure, creating jobs that allowed young people to stay instead of fleeing to distant cities. The old Porter House had been restored with community effort, neighbors contributing labor, skills and materials until the sagging porch stood straight and windows gleamed with new glass. It felt like home now in ways their suburban house never had, every room holding memories being actively created rather than ghosts of a hidden past. Emily had claimed the master bedroom, transforming it into a space filled with books and art supplies. The twins shared the room that had once been Michael's, their energy filling spaces that had been silent too long. Jake's room overlooked the creek, where he spent hours watching for the wildlife that had become as familiar as old friends. Emily stood in the community library 3 afternoons a week, teaching reading to children whose parents worked shifts at the new visitor center or led trail expeditions. At 14, she'd found purpose in passing knowledge forward, her grief channeled into creating futures for kids who reminded her of her younger brothers. Rachel watched through the library window as Emily patiently sounded out words with a 6-year-old, her daughter's face reflecting patience and compassion that seemed impossibly mature. Loss had aged Emily, but it had also revealed strength that might have remained dormant in easier circumstances. The twins had become junior naturalists, their childhood curiosity finding perfect outlet in cataloguing the reserve's ecosystem. They maintained detailed notebooks, unconscious echoes of their father's childhood journals, filled with sketches of animal tracks, recordings of bird calls, observations about seasonal changes. A university in Missoula had partnered with the reserve, sending graduate students to mentor Will and Evan in proper scientific documentation. The boys thrived under the attention, their grief expressing itself through fierce dedication to protecting the land their father had loved enough to send them toward. Jake had found his own form of healing in a scruffy dog adopted from a family whose ranch was struggling. The mutt was part shepherd, part mystery, all loyalty and boundless energy. Jake had named him Mikey without hesitation, and Rachel hadn't been able to speak for several minutes, emotions closing her throat while her youngest son threw sticks for a dog who carried his father's name. Now Mikey followed Jake everywhere, patient companion to a 6-year-old still processing losses too large for his vocabulary. Before we reach the end of Rachel's journey, I want to thank you for being here. If this story touched your heart, if you felt Rachel's struggle and triumph, please subscribe to our channel. We're building a community of people who believe in stories of courage, resilience, and hope. Hit that subscribe button and help us continue sharing these powerful tales. Your support changes everything. The cemetery sat on a hillside overlooking the valley, headstones weathered by decades of Montana weather. Rachel visited Michael's parents' graves first, Thomas and Catherine Porter, who'd fled to protect their son and died in distant cities, never seeing Silver Creek again. Fresh wildflowers sat in the holders Rachel had installed, her way of honoring sacrifices she'd only recently understood. Then she walked to the newest stone, simple granite engraved with Michael's name and the dates that bookended a life cut too short. "We did it," she said softly, kneeling on grass, still damp with morning dew. "The kids are thriving. Silver Creek is protected. Whitmore gave up after his lawyers reviewed the documents. Turns out century-old water rights are pretty ironclad." She smiled through tears that came easier now, less bitter than they'd been. "You sent us here knowing I'd have to be brave enough for both of us. I hated you for that at first, for leaving me to fight battles you couldn't face. But I understand now. You didn't send us here to run away, Michael. You sent us home." The sun was setting when Rachel finally walked back toward town, painting the mountains in shades of amber and rose that made the landscape look unreal in its beauty. Ahead, she could see Silver Creek's main street coming alive with evening activity, lights glowing in shop windows, people gathering at the cafe, the sound of laughter drifting on wind that smelled of pine and approaching summer. The community had found new life, not through sacrifice to corporate development, but through commitment to preservation and sustainable growth that honored what came before. At the edge of the reserve, Rachel spotted her children, Emily with a book under her arm heading home from the library, Will and Evan examining something in the creek bed with flashlights and excited voices, Jake racing through tall grass with Mikey bounding beside him. They were laughing, genuinely laughing, the sound carrying across the valley like music. 6 months ago they'd been 4 shattered souls driving toward an unknown destination with only grief for company. Now they were children again, changed by loss but not defined by it, rooted in a place that gave them purpose and belonging. Rachel stood watching until twilight deepened into true darkness, and stars emerged in impossible numbers, undimmed by city lights that didn't exist here. She thought about the girl she'd been when she married Michael, the woman she'd become raising their children, the person she'd had to transform into when death ripped away every certainty. Loss had broken her, but the pieces had reformed into something stronger, more resilient, capable of carrying weights she'd never imagined shouldering. Silver Creek spread below her, the community illuminated against gathering night, a constellation of lights representing families, dreams, futures protected through courage she hadn't known she possessed. Michael had given her this, his final gift wrapped in mystery and fear, and the desperate hope that love would be enough motivation to face what he couldn't. And as Rachel finally turned toward home, toward children who needed dinner and homework help and bedtime stories, she understood the truth he'd known all along. What she'd lost had opened pathways to something immeasurably greater, a home built on deep roots, a purpose larger than herself, and a future where her children would never have to run from who they were or where they came from. The house waited, lights glowing warm against the darkness, and Rachel walked toward it knowing that some journeys end exactly where they were always meant to begin.